In this video, I'm going to be discussing who I think would win in a fight between the Juggernaut and Doomsday. So, starting off, Cain Marko is the stepbrother of Charles Xavier. On an expedition with his brother, they were trapped in a cave where he encountered the Gem of Sidorak, which essentially binds him in like a sort of vow with a nigh omnipotent being that resides in another world known as Sidorak, who really just tasked Cain Marko with destroying as much as he can. And after this, Cain Marko took up the name Juggernaut. Now, in terms of powers that the gem gives Cain, he is like capable of fighting with Hulk on equal grounds, capable of injuring Hulk, taking attacks from the Hulk, and he's run into the Hulk many times throughout the past few years in comics. Their record is not determined. Sometimes Hulk wins, sometimes Juggernaut wins. Very famous clip of Stan Lee, actually being polled on this and asking who he would think would win a fight, and he answered that it really just depends on who's writing. Now, the main claim to fame for the Juggernaut that the Gem of Sidorak gives him is his invulnerability. The Gem of Sidorak, although it's not very common knowledge, does provide Marko with more than just physical resistance. It also provides him with a force field that envelops his entire body and essentially prevents him from taking any sort of physical damage. This, of course, includes bludgeoning, but it also is extended to things like fire, cold, and really just any other non-magic or telekinetic-based attack you can think of. And in terms of other powers, as gimmicky as it sounds, the Juggernaut is literally unstoppable. It's a part of his magic, is if he wants to get from point A to point B and he's traveling to, close that distance, nothing can stop him wholly from moving. He can be slowed down, but he can't be stopped. Even World War Hulk wasn't able to stop him from moving. In terms of other feats, and I guess where he scales in terms of speed, he's able to tag characters like Speedball, who are pretty easily able to avoid bullets. That being said, in terms of comic book characters, being able to react to bullets is relatively not that high up there as a feat. Most characters are going to be way faster than that. And Juggernaut, while being able to throw hands with characters like Thor and Hulk, who can be scaled to those higher levels of speed, massively faster than light speeds, he's always noted to be a kind of slow fighter, and thus he wouldn't necessarily scale to quite those numbers. Although in this fight, it doesn't seem that speed would really be too big of a factor, because both Juggernaut and Doomsday are very simple fighters that just enjoy throwing punches and taking punches all the same. Other powers that the Gem of Sidorak give Cain Marko are, high level regeneration. One of the highest and strongest healing factors, I think, in comics. He's been able to completely regenerate from being just a skeleton, and that is, of course, not even super relevant most of the time, because he's just not going to take that much damage that could reduce him to the part where he would need to regenerate. But it is something that he has in his toolkit. In terms of scaling, the best feat we have for Juggernaut, which does seem very consistent with general showings for the character, although he is among the most varied characters depending on the writer and the storyline. So one of his stronger feats, of course, is being able to go toe-to-toe with World War Hulk. World War Hulk being one of the stronger incarnations of the Hulk, after being sent to a planet, gaining a lot of rage, and then returning to Earth to exact his revenge against the members of the Illuminati who sent him off. So in this fight, it is worth noting that World War Hulk wasn't quite fighting at full World Breaker strength. He wasn't really doing his best. He was a little suppressed. But even then, Juggernaut was able to injure World War Hulk, and World War Hulk obviously wasn't really able to do any damage to the Juggernaut, and instead won the fight by simply throwing the Juggernaut off of the Earth and into space. And of course, this version of Hulk scales above other incarnations of Hulk, one of which was fully capable of fighting against Odin Force Thor, who himself is capable of shaking the entire world tree Yggdrasil. And of course, for those who may not be familiar, Yggdrasil is the the tree that connects all the 9 realms, both in Norse mythology and in Marvel Universe. And by the mapping of the Marvel cosmology that we have, this would imply that it can hold together essentially the entire multiverse of Marvel, thus making both Hulk and Thor with the power of Odin upwards of multiversal levels of strength. And some may even consider this kind of like a low ball for the Hulk, with some of his feats, putting him at outer versal levels, like his fight with the One Below All. But I think this is probably a little more consistent, especially with the version of Hulk that we see Juggernaut actually fighting. In terms of weaknesses, there's really only two ways that the Juggernaut can realistically be defeated. One is through mental attacks, and to be fair, Juggernaut's helmet does allow him to protect against mental attacks, so it doesn't usually come into play. But if his helmet's ever removed, then he's susceptible to any sort of mental attack and can be folded very easily by it. And aside from that, he's also susceptible to magic-based attacks because the Gem of Sidorak only provides him with physical resistance and resistance to physical attacks, and thus not magic. In the panel on the right, we can actually see Thor using his magic to take away the Hulk or Juggernaut's invulnerability shield, and is thus able to fight him kind of on even grounds. So with that out of the way, we have Doomsday pretty much explained, and now we have Juggernaut mostly explained, so we're going to go into Doomsday scaling. So Doomsday is a creature that was created in a lab by a scientist. Essentially, his claim to fame is that Doomsday can adapt to any situation he's put in. So when he was just, a fetus, an embryo, he was basically subject to like a bunch of experiments, killed repeatedly over and over, and then brought back to life with immunity to whatever killed him. And over time, he just became the strongest creature that, science could breed. In terms of how long he spent, it kind of worked, I guess, like a hyperbolic time chamber where he was able to experience I think it's like 25 million years, although it was over the course of a few decades. So he's really just like the height of evolution is kind of, I guess, the motif they were going for with him. In terms of like feats, he's able to contend pretty handedly with Superman and Supergirl. Of course, in his first introduction in comics, Doomsday actually kills Superman. They kill each other. They go 1-for-1 on it. And of course, Superman himself is definitely no slouch when it comes to high power feats. For example, he was able to literally lift all of reality on his shoulders as a favor for Atlas. In terms of other feats that we see Doomsday go through, and although this feat may seem like a bit of an outlier, and there are statements from the writer saying that he didn't really value Darkseid as much of a physical threat as we've really come to know him as, it's still impressive that Doomsday was really able to put the beat down on Darkseid. He is a being that Darkseid respects and fears. Darkseid, of course, being a character who can very casually consume universes, throw hands with characters like the Anti-Monitor, who are already multiversal level threats. Aside from that, Doomsday is also able to throw hands with both post and pre-Crisis Superman. Pre-Crisis Superman and post-Crisis Superman being comparable in strength, at least somewhat, to Superboy Prime, who himself is capable of fighting off both the Yellow and Green Lantern cores. Ion, who is a Daxamite powered by the power of all of the Green Lanterns, and just has crazy scaling, even up to like 5th dimension. But I guess another feat for Superman Prime, and one of the more famous, pre-Crisis Superman, and one of the more famous ones, is that he's able to sneeze away an entire solar system, which is like a very casual feat. So essentially, from all of these fights, we can kind of put Doomsday at that multiversal to like high multiversal level of strength. He's very easily able to tank hits from characters like pre-Crisis Superman, who should scale the high multiversal, and of course he's also capable of doing like massive damage to characters like that as well. One of Doomsday's claims to fame, and maybe one of the things that gets him the most hype when it comes to these versus battle debates, is his adaptability. So there's definitely an instance where he was able to adapt the weakness of Martian Manhunter, that being like fire. So when he was fighting Martian Manhunter, after some time he was able to adapt. He gained the ability to breathe fire, which he never showed before that, and he was thus able to defeat Martian Manhunter. I've also heard it mentioned before that he has the ability to adapt kryptonite, which he used in a fight against Superman. And I think this stems from a slight misconception over who the character Kryptonite Doomsday is. Kryptonite Doomsday is like a science experiment where the US government infused Doomsday cells with kryptonite and injected it into like a willing test subject. So this isn't Doomsday. This is just a different character altogether. I haven't been able to find any sort of reference to Doomsday adapting kryptonite, so I think that this is probably where that stems from. So one thing about Doomsday that gets hyped up a lot, and I think it's worth discussing because it's not super consistent with what we've seen in comics, is the idea that once he dies, he can never die the same way again, right? Basically, in his first iteration, Doomsday got beaten to death by Superman, but then subsequently, we've seen him get beaten to death multiple times after that. In the panel on the left was an example, though, just a group of Kryptonians who were on Earth just grabbed Doomsday, brought him to the moon, and just beat him just straight to death. Absolutely busted him. You can see him lying in a pool of his own blood. And so the way I think the general community agrees that we can interpret this is that Doomsday can technically die from like the same means, but he won't be able to die to a means of, how do you say this? He won't die from the same amount of force that was applied to kill him the first time. So, for example, when Superman was able to kill him, it was just by bludgeoning him. So after that, he would need to be bludgeoned harder than Superman was able to bludgeon him for him to die, right? Or just like to sustain more bludgeoning damage over like a longer period of time, like he probably did when he was absolutely destroyed by the group of Kryptonians. So it doesn't work quite in the way that, you know, he can't die from physical damage, but more so that it becomes increasingly hard to kill him from physical damage. So with the stats and such out of the way, it's time to really go into who I think would win. And, you know, I think this is a very complicated issue, especially because comic book characters have like a very wide range on what exactly you can consider their like feats. It really depends on which characters you want to be generous. When I analyze, I try to be as generous as I can to both, while still like keeping it relatively grounded and making sure feats are like claims are consistent with, you know, general showings and not just like one-off panel images. It's also worth exploring what the win conditions of this fight could be, because these characters are notoriously hard to kill. And in general, I think for versus battles, there's like 4 major criteria for what can count as a win. One is going to be BFR, the abbreviation for battlefield removal. And this is the most common way that Juggernaut is ever, like, you know, defeated. He just gets thrown into space and he can't really do anything about it. This probably won't come up too often in this fight. Neither Juggernaut nor Doomsday are the kind of people to pick up their opponent and just toss them away. They both definitely prefer fighting to the bloody death. And I think that makes it a more exciting fight anyway. The next is Knockout. Although Doomsday, you know, shows resistance to being, you know, bludgeoned to death, doesn't necessarily mean he can't be knocked out, and he has been knocked out in the past. Same with Juggernaut, although his like knockouts have been, you know, slightly weaker versions of him, or character like versions of him where he didn't have the power that gives him the invulnerability to physical damage. Death, of course, obviously counts if a character is killed. And here I also want to make the important note. Normally when people talk about Doomsday, they won't count his death as him losing the fight, because Doomsday is implied to always be able to come back after death. But, you know, in terms of like a fight, once he dies, it's not like he gets up instantly and is able to fight right again. Usually there's like a period of time where he needs to like recuperate, regenerate, and then he can get back into the fight later. But I would count him getting knocked down and, you know, killed as a win for Juggernaut. And then the last condition is incapacitation. Again, doesn't really apply for either of these characters. They're not the types to try incapacitating outside of a knockout. But, you know, if either of them is able to put the other in a situation where they're just trapped, unable to move, then that also counts as a win. So given these win conditions and what I've talked about, I think that the winner of the fight is pretty handedly going to be Juggernaut. Although I do think that there's a very good case for Doomsday to be made, and I'll go into that in just a moment. But the reason I'm picking Juggernaut is we've seen time and time again he's able to output an irrelevant amount of force for taking down somebody like Doomsday. He may not be as strong as the Hulk, the Juggernaut that is. He may not be as strong as the Hulk, but over time, if it's a long drawn out battle, his punches are going to be doing damage to Doomsday. And alternative, like on the other hand, Juggernaut's invulnerability is literally like infinite. There's no amount of physical damage that he could take from Doomsday that would ever put him down, and I think that puts him at a very big advantage against a character like Doomsday, who kind of relies solely on physical strength. Now, some may argue that Doomsday isn't exactly defeatable through brute strength, but we've seen it not just once, not just twice. We've seen it multiple times where he's able to get beaten down by characters who are either stronger than him, around the same level as him, or a group of characters that maybe are a little weaker than him that just hit him repeatedly. So in like a long drawn out fight with the Juggernaut, if the Juggernaut's not falling, Doomsday is gonna fall first. In terms of win conditions, there is one condition I can see where Doomsday does win, and personally, I think it's a little inconsistent with the way he's been written in the past years, but I think that there's a very valid argument. And that's, so first of all, Juggernaut has unlimited stamina, and Doomsday has near unlimited stamina, right? If they're fighting, the fight's going to last a very, very long time. That being said, as they're punching each other, if Doomsday is able to fulfill these two win conditions, he might be able to pull off a win. One, just from the force of punching Juggernaut, eventually knock off his helmet, right? And then while his helmet is off, if Doomsday can, similar to how he adapted Heat Breath to fight Martian Manhunter, adapt some sort of like telepathic attack that he can use to, attack Juggernaut in a non-physical way, just attack his brain, then that is a win condition. Now, I think this is maybe a bit of a stretch. We've really only ever seen Doomsday adapt like this, where he's able to, actively adapt to a character's weakness and use it to kill them, or I guess just defeat Martian Manhunter, once, as far as I could find. But, if you are a Doomsday glazer and you want to say, Doomsday's adaptability works on like this, almost like omniscient level where it knows exactly what it needs to win in a fight, then, Doomsday will win. Because this fight will definitely take long enough that he would be able to adapt. And then if he's able to adapt that and get off the helmet, it's just a matter of time before he beats Juggernaut. Otherwise, I think Juggernaut just has the physical stamina, defense, and attack power to just beat Doomsday in like a long, slogged out fight. But I will say again, I think that this is a fight that, given both of the characters' like track records, could last years. Like literal years, and really the true loser of this matchup is going to be like anybody that lives on the planet that it happens on. So, made this video for fun. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and peace.